This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 99. Welcome to the 99th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I started this podcast because I believe that every woman has the right to know exactly how her body and her fertility works. I'm here to connect you with the tools and information that you need to improve your menstrual cycle health and fertility. And I feel so privileged to be able to share my passion for body literacy and fertility awareness with you every single week. Fertility awareness is so much more than just birth control or trying to get pregnant, because it truly gives you a window into your own health and fertility. And I love sharing my expertise with my clients and helping them to understand their charts and connect with their cycles. If you've recently discovered fertility awareness but you're not feeling confident about using it for birth control just yet, or if you've been charting for a while and you're having trouble making sense of what's happening in your cycle, I can help. Get started today with a free 15-minute consultation with me by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/coaching, or just click the Work With Me button on my website. And I would also like to invite you to sign up for the Fertility Friday newsletter. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/ebook, and as a gift to you, you'll receive a free copy of my new ebook, where I reveal what to expect when coming off of hormonal contraceptives, and I share 5 steps to restoring healthy menstrual cycles post-pill. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Kelsey Kinney, to the show. Kelsey was recently married, so you may know her as Kelsey Marksteiner, which is her maiden name. Kelsey is a registered dietitian, and she quickly learned in her program that she wasn't being taught what dietitians should really be teaching their patients. She decided to study functional medicine, open her own practice, and pursue her dream of working with clients who really care about themselves and who want to invest in their health and receive support along their health journey. And in today's show, Kelsey and I will be talking about adrenal health, HPA axis dysregulation, and basically stress and how it can impact fertility. I've had a number of questions from my listeners about adrenal fatigue, about HPA axis dysregulation, and especially the impact that it can have on a woman's fertility and her fertility hormones. So I'm really excited to delve into these topics with Kelsey today. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Kelsey.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I'm really, really excited to be here today.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. And, before we dive into all these topics, I would really love to hear just a little bit more about your background and how you found your way into the world of functional nutrition.
Sure. That's a big question. I'll try to keep it fairly short. But like you mentioned in the intro, I went to school to become an RD, and part of that process is working in a hospital during your internship. I mean, granted, I guess I basically learned that a hospital is not the place that you go to get help, like in a long-term solution kind of way. It's an immediate acute care facility. And so being a dietitian there, talking to patients about what they can do with their diet to help them live a healthier life, they weren't open to it and they weren't ready to hear it at that moment, which I completely understand. But it made me realize that a lot of what is so important about working with someone one-on-one to really help them in their life is that they really have to be ready for that help. So I determined at that point that I really did not want to work in a hospital setting because I just didn't feel like people were at the point where they were ready to receive help. And of course, a lot of what I learned in school becoming an RD and what we are technically, quote unquote, allowed to teach just has not worked out for a lot of people, and I'm sure your listeners know this if they've been listening to you for a long time. But things like the whole low fat recommendations, things like that just at this point don't really have a whole lot of scientific backing, never mind actually being useful for people in achieving their health goals. So those two things combined made me decide that I wanted to open up a private practice. So I did just that. And it's really been an amazing experience to do that. I've ended up sort of settling on digestive health clients for the most part, though I work with a lot of different types of clients. digestive health and, of course, adrenal fatigue. Those are my two big kind of areas that I tend to get clients in. And it's been really interesting to see the amazing progress that people get when they focus on their adrenal health, their stress, and how their digestion is working. And we'll talk a little bit about how those two things connect, because they do, even though they seem very different. But I'm sure we'll jump into that once we get further into this conversation. But yeah, so I've been doing that for the last, I think it's probably been 4 or 5 years at this point. And it's been a really rewarding experience, like I said, to just see the progress that people make when they start to look at root causes of why they're having symptoms rather than just treating symptoms themselves with medications. And yeah, it's been really amazing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and some of the listeners, I'm sure, will know you from your podcast, the Ancestral RDs podcast. And so I would also love just to hear you touch on the kind of that intersection of ancestral nutrition as well, because I know that plays a role in your practice.
Yeah. So that is something I've been interested in for a long, long time, because like I was talking about before, the kinds of things that you learn as an RD in school is, like I said, the low fat, low cholesterol recommendations. There's still surprisingly a lot of processed food recommendations that go into that. And to me, it just seemed unnatural to just recommend that kind of thing. Because if you think about our ancestors and how they were eating, I mean, it was a real food diet. They weren't concerned about the fat content or, even the carbohydrate content of anything. They just ate whole, real foods. And we don't think like that anymore. A lot of us don't. I'm sure your listeners do, hopefully. But I think that is something that is so important to overall health, because those foods are deeply, deeply nourishing. They have all of the nutrients that we need if we actually eat them. And they don't have a lot of things that are harmful to our bodies, like chemicals, pesticides. If you avoid those things, those definitely, of course, can be present on fruits and vegetables. But if you avoid those things, they're not there. And so to me, it just made sense to eat a real food diet that didn't include all of these processed things that we have available to us now. And I've just seen, like I said, great progress with recommending that kind of diet to my clients. And so Laura Schoenfeld and I, my co-host of the Ancestral RDs podcast, we decided that we would create that podcast because it was such a fascinating topic to us and we were both very passionate about it. So we've been doing that for a couple of years now, and we just talk about all things real whole food and ancestral nutrition.
Mm-hmm. I love that. It's so important, and especially because the science backs it up. It's really interesting how we kind of continue the same way we've always gone, even though the science is saying, no, stop, wait.
Right. What are you doing?
Dial it back.
Exactly.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And it's also really tragic in a way, the impact it has on people, because people think that they're doing the best possible thing for themselves, kind of trucking along, towing the party line of, fat-free, low cholesterol, when it can actually be doing more harm than good.
Yeah. And especially when it comes to fertility, eating that fat, eating the cholesterol, eating these nutrient-rich foods that just usually aren't part of our diet anymore, things like liver or other organ meats that are so nutrient-rich that we just have kind of taken out of our diet at this point and swapped it for processed foods, or just taken it out completely and not really replaced it with anything. That's deeply sad to me, because I think if people that are trying to conceive included these foods in their diet, they'd be so much better off, and their children would be so much better off. And it's just something that isn't taught a lot at all. And that's the sad part to me, because there are so many people who are trying to do the best that they can, but they're getting sort of the wrong education about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for any of the listeners who want to kind of delve into more of that, I did, in the episode that I did with Laura Schoenfeld, your co-host, that was one of the previous episodes I did. I think it was number 12, and I'll link it into the show notes page. She really delved into the nutritional aspects, especially of coming off of birth control and replenishing the nutrients that are depleted while on it. And so that's a really great episode just to get your mindset kind of around the dietary things that are really important for fertility. And so I'd love to delve into today's topic. And I guess just to start us off, maybe you could just talk a little bit about adrenal fatigue. What is it and how does it present in the clients that you see?
Sure. So I would assume that maybe some of your listeners have probably heard that term before, adrenal fatigue. And I guess before we jump into exactly what it is, I do want to be clear that the term adrenal fatigue is actually a bit of a misnomer. And Laura and I still use that term just because it's how everybody kind of refers to it. But I just like to make people aware that, you know, when you think about that term, adrenal fatigue, it makes you think that the adrenals themselves are exhausted. You know, they're fatigued, they're exhausted, they're not functioning because they just can't. They don't have the energy for it. And that's the idea behind what is portrayed when a lot of people and practitioners talk about adrenal fatigue, just that the adrenals, you know, they get so stressed that eventually they can't keep up with the demand for cortisol, our stress hormone. And that's actually not true. And so a better term for adrenal fatigue is really called HPA axis dysregulation or dysfunction, because there's a whole network of organs, specifically the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenals, so HPA, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. And those things work together. They create that axis. And when that system itself becomes dysregulated, that's when the symptoms of so-called adrenal fatigue start to show up. But the hypothalamus and the pituitary are actually in the brain. And so those are the things that actually start to get dysregulated, and those signals aren't going through properly. So it really is not the adrenals becoming too fatigued to function. It's actually just a matter of all of these signals that go through our brain to create the push for cortisol production that get messed up, that get dysregulated. And so referring to it as HPA axis dysregulation or dysfunction is much more specific to how this actually works. So that said, I'll probably still refer to it throughout here as adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysregulation. And like I said, that's just simply because so many people know the term adrenal fatigue, and it's a little bit easier to say than HPA axis dysregulation. I'm sure you can understand that.
Say that 5 times fast.
Exactly. Tongue twister right there. So when we think about the HPA axis and the stress response, let's come up with a little scenario here. So imagine you are one of our ancestors, you know, in the wild, and you're walking around trying to forage some berries. And all of a sudden you come into contact with like a bear, like you see a bear. So the first thing that happens there, and this is going to get a little bit sciencey, so the terms are a little bit long, kind of annoying to say, but just bear with me because I think it's important to just understand how this process works so that when we start to talk about the symptoms that adrenal fatigue causes, we understand where those symptoms are coming from. So the first thing that happens when you come into contact with a stressor like that is that our body releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, and we'll call that CRH for short. That's released from the hypothalamus, and then CRH then goes within the blood to the pituitary gland, so that's the P in HPA. And that stimulates the production of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, and then ACTH goes to the adrenal gland, where it stimulates the production of cortisol, and that's our main stress hormone. So when we talk about being stressed or feeling stressed, a lot of what we're talking about is that cortisol production, which you can actually measure. And so we can tell how stressed people are when we measure the amount of cortisol that they're producing. So that's the main process that happens when we actually come into contact with a stressor. And it's a completely normal process. It's supposed to happen because it actually helps us to either run away from the situation, or let's say we were going to fight back against that bear. We have the energy, we have the adrenaline and everything to do that. And so you probably have heard that sympathetic system response called the fight or flight system, because literally that's exactly what your body is preparing to do, to fight or run away. And so, like I said, that's a totally normal response. And it's very, very useful, of course, because if we're in a situation like that and we need to run away or we need to fight back, our body has the ability to do that due to all the hormones and different things that happen when that stress response happens.
Mm-hmm.
But what doesn't happen when we're in that mode is more maintenance tasks like digestion or the production of reproductive hormones, things like that, we need to be in a calm, low stress sort of environment to do. You can imagine that when you're running away from a bear, the last thing probably on your body's mind is, okay, let me digest this apple that I just ate, right? So the body goes through these phases basically where sometimes it's in fight or flight mode and sometimes it's in rest and digest mode. And as long as there's a good balance between those two and you're much more often in your rest and digest mode than you are in fight or flight mode, the body functions normally. And so when we get into a fight or flight mode, our body has a system called a negative feedback loop that will turn off the HPA axis when it's not needed. So when we then, get out of the way of the bear, or maybe we fought the bear and we won. Let's go with that. So the stressor is over. Your body has high stress hormones at that point. But when it produces these high amounts of stress hormones, that then sends a feedback loop to the brain to say, okay, we've got these hormones here. We don't need them anymore. So let's start to turn this system off because hopefully the stressor will be over in a minute. So that's how it normally works. And we want it to work like that. But in our modern society, we are constantly stressed out. We have little stressors. They're not as big as coming into contact with a bear and having to run away or fight it. It could be something as simple as sitting in traffic when you're late for work, or fighting with your spouse, or something like your boss yells at you because the project you're doing is late. Something like that, these things aren't huge, but they're happening all the time. And so what can happen there is that this stress response really never gets turned off. And so we're constantly in this sort of moderate fight or flight mode. And to our body, it's the same thing as being in full-fledged fight or flight mode. We don't see a difference between traffic and fighting off a bear. It's kind of the same thing when it comes to the hormones that are actually produced in your body. So does that make sense to you, Lisa?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that what I like about the picture that you painted as well is that you're stressing that it's a natural physiological response. I think whenever we hear stress, we think it's always bad, but it's necessary for our bodies to have that capability, to have that stress response, but also to recognize that our ancestors arguably didn't have just constant stress. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also interesting. So I recently interviewed Dr. Dan Kalish, and we talked a little bit about stress and adrenal function. And, he talked also about some of the other factors that you wouldn't really think of as stress. Like your boss yelling at you is obviously stress, but there's other factors that put stress on your body that you wouldn't necessarily think are stressors. Like, for instance, exposing your body to those pesticides and things that we talked about, or just other types of things that are kind of add to that chronic stress response, but that we wouldn't identify as like, that's obviously stress.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in here with, I had mentioned earlier that there is a connection between your digestion and your stress response. And part of that is like where I was talking about before, that rest and digest system. We're not really digesting if we're in fight or flight mode, but also the fact that we have this microbiome in our gut, which is a collection of bacteria. And a lot of times that can get imbalanced. So you can have too much bad bacteria and not enough good bacteria, or you can have overgrowths of specific type of bacteria in your microbiome or in your small intestine. And those things are inherently stressful because essentially it's an infection of some kind that your body has to fight off. And so if you just leave those things unchecked, your body is constantly having to feel like it's fighting off, this overgrowth of bacteria, or trying so hard to balance that good and bad bacteria in your gut that, it kind of doesn't have the time or energy to focus on other things because it's so focused on getting that under control all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the link between stress and gut dysbiosis isn't exactly apparent, but as you said, it could just be triggering your stress response kind of continuously. unbeknownst to you and causing a lot of problems. One of the questions that I wanted to delve into as well is, how does HPA axis dysregulation impact the reproductive hormone cycle for women? How does this impact their fertility?
Sure. So let's start with the basics here, I think, because it's important. You can get really, really scientific with all of this stuff, but at the end of the day, really, it's just about stress relief. So let's think about that example of our ancestor running into a bear. So we talked about that kickstarts the stress response, the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight mode. And that requires a lot of energy, adrenaline, mental brain power. And like we were talking about before, it takes away the focus on things like digestion or creating sex hormones so that fertility and reproductive ability are there. Because that's not what the body is focused on at that moment. And when that's just a small portion of the time that we spend, when we're in that fight or flight mode, that's okay. The body can get over that if, let's say 60 or 80% of the time you're in rest and digest mode and you don't have to be worrying about all this other stressful stuff. But when a lot of us are stressed all the time and our HPA axis is constantly being activated, we are almost always in that fight or flight mode. And so there's really so much less of an opportunity to create those sex hormones that help us reproduce. And so we need to focus then on being in that rest and digest mode a lot more often, because otherwise the amount of stress that we're under causes us not to be able to create the sex hormones that we need. So that's the basic way to talk about it. And then the little bit more complicated way to talk about it is that a lot of times when people have fertility issues, it can be due to elevated androgens like testosterone or androstenedione. And those things contribute to PCOS type symptoms like menstrual dysfunction or unwanted hair growth, weight gain, all of that kind of stuff. And, we usually think about PCOS as being a insulin-related process, or, that someone has to be overweight to have PCOS or has to even have cysts on the ovaries to have PCOS, but those things actually aren't true. And someone can actually have adrenal-related PCOS, where this chronic stress elevates ACTH, remember, one of those first hormones in the process that eventually creates cortisol, our stress hormone. And ACTH actually stimulates androgen secretion. And we were talking about how there's negative feedback loops for cortisol and stress hormones, that when we have high amounts of them, it then tells the brain, okay, we're good. We don't need this anymore. You can turn this system off. But for androgens, when the secretion of androgens is stimulated by ACTH, there's actually no negative feedback loop for that. So those levels just keep getting higher and higher and higher the more stressed out you are. And there's no way to kind of turn that off other than you relaxing, de-stressing, and giving your body a chance to rest. So
for women with PCOS, if they are at high levels of stress, their bodies are producing tons of cortisol, and that also contributes to this increase of testosterone production. And it sounds like it's kind of just like a runaway train.
Exactly. So yeah, there's no way inside the body to turn that off other than you as the human saying, okay, I need to get away from this stress and sleep more and eat enough and not over exercise, all those things. And I'm sure we'll get to how we can reduce stress a little bit later.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, so now that we've kind of painted a picture of what's happening hormonally, I would love for you to paint a picture of then how a woman would know if her HPA axis is dysregulated. So when you see clients and they're coming to you, what are their symptoms? Like, how do they feel? And what are the things that you notice of your clients who are struggling with adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysregulation?
Sure. So one of the main things I see is people that just feel utterly exhausted. You could wake up having gotten what felt like a normal night of sleep and just feel like you had been run over by a truck. And you just wake up, you barely get through the day. You might have to take a few cups of coffee to even feel remotely like you can function. And then weirdly, later in the night, you will tend to get this second wind of energy where, let's say 10 p.m. comes around and all of a sudden you feel like you're a totally different person. You have energy. You could go do the work that you weren't able to get done earlier in the day. And then you end up, staying up too late and, or not sleeping well. And so then this process sort of starts all over again. So that combination is really, really common, feeling exhausted throughout the day and then getting a second wind at night. Sleep issues in general are rampant. That can include feeling like you can't fall asleep, so having some sort of insomnia, or it can be that you sleep through the night, but then you're waking up multiple times a night. So usually I would say that's anywhere from like 2 to 6 times a night that you would be waking up. And sometimes when you wake up, you'll feel almost like you get this shot of adrenaline. Like you wake up and your heart is pounding, you might be sweating a little bit. It almost feels like that fight or flight response, because actually what is often happening there is that you get this sudden increase of cortisol overnight and your body shoots out adrenaline. So you wake up feeling like, oh my God, what just happened, So that's really common as well. Feeling like you can't exercise very well. So just feeling like you can't really recover from exercise. You might try to do some exercise and maybe you even get through it okay. But then the next day, your body is just feeling terrible. Like you're really sore for long periods of time. You just feel like you can't recover properly to be able to exercise consistently. Some people get dizziness when they go from like sitting down to a standing up position, or they crave salt. Both of those things have to do with your blood pressure. And the thing with the HPA axis is that it affects your blood pressure. And oftentimes people will have low blood pressure because of the altered adrenal hormones that are being produced when your HPA axis is dysfunctioning. And so you'll get these symptoms of low blood sugar, like wanting to eat a lot of salt or being dizzy when you stand up. That's very, very common. Some other things that can be affected here are your cognitive ability. So a lot of people will describe to me that they feel like they have brain fog, quote unquote, just feeling like they're sort of in a cloud a lot of the time and they can't think clearly. They have a hard time getting work done. They just can't concentrate, and maybe even a little bit of memory issues coming in there. And usually that sort of symptom is something that goes away in that second wind time at night, where they finally feel like, oh my gosh, I can think clearly again. Another thing that people experience is that their sex drive might be lower. And that can be due to, some of the hormones that are affected when your HPA axis starts to dysregulate. Other people can get higher sex drive. It just sort of depends on the way that your HPA axis dysfunctions or becomes dysregulated. And there are actually quite a few different ways that can happen. And so it sort of depends on which pattern you are expressing when your HPA axis is dysregulated. So, but any sort of sex hormone disruption, so levels that are off, can certainly be related to adrenal fatigue as well.
Mm-hmm. And then for your female clients, are they getting regular happy periods, or is their menstrual cycle impacted by this?
It can go either way. Some women with adrenal fatigue, their periods are totally unaffected, but for a lot of them, they're having irregular periods. And this is because one of the ways that the body can be under stress is when we, a lot of times, accidentally do it to ourselves. So a woman might be under eating, she might be over exercising, she might not be sleeping enough. All of those things are this perfect trifecta that create a recipe for hormone imbalance. And when you have that hormone imbalance and your body is just so stressed out, this definitely affects the way that your cycle works. And oftentimes women will experience irregular cycles because of that.
Okay. Well, so now that we've painted this like gloomy, doomy picture.
Yeah, that sounds like fun, right?
Yeah, totally. That sounds awesome. So how do we address this and reverse it?
All right. Excellent question. The practical side of stuff here. Yay. And, this is something that I really like to talk about because when you go to your doctor a lot of times and they can tell that you're under stress, maybe you're trying to conceive, you're having a difficult time with it. And that inherently is a very stressful process. And your doctor will just say to you, just relax, don't worry about it. It's like, well, gee, thanks, doctor. Like, that's not very helpful.
Not very practical.
So, yeah, exactly. So, I think it's something that we all know. If you can tell that you're stressed out, the obvious answer is, okay, let's relax and not worry about this. But that's so much harder to actually do than it is to tell someone to do. And so, I've been through this process where, I had adrenal fatigue personally, and I've had to learn how to manage my stress in a way that is doable for me and that actually makes me feel really good and not just feel like I'm telling myself to relax and I'm not actually doing anything. So when I say that, what can you actually do to de-stress? There are a couple different things that I like to recommend. And one of the most common ones that you might hear are things like mind-body activities. And those include things like yoga, meditation. So one of my favorite apps to recommend to people trying to get their stress under control for meditation is an app called Headspace. Have you ever heard of that, Lisa?
I have heard of it, but I haven't used it yet.
Yeah. It's awesome. I think they have a free version of it where it has like 10-minute meditations that you can start with and see how you like it. So I often recommend that my clients give that a shot if they think that meditation might work for them. Deep breathing, and an app I like for that is called Stress Doctor. And it's on your phone. You can watch yourself breathe in and out. And it tells you, how sort of in sync you are with your heart rate, variability, how you're breathing, how deep you're breathing. It's really fantastic. You can do Tai Chi. There are so many different mind-body activities that you can try. And I would say the most important thing to determine is to figure out what you actually enjoy. I think a lot of women, and I'll include myself in that, feel like, okay, I've heard a lot about meditation. I've heard it's really good for me. Let me try doing this, only to realize that it's totally boring for them and it's not enjoyable whatsoever. And that was me. I was like, okay, I need to like meditation because I know it's supposed to be good. And I tried it and I didn't like it very much. And I realized that for me, things like that were a little bit more active. So something like yoga, where I was actually moving my body a little bit, were so much better for me. And then I eventually determined that things like deep breathing worked really well for me. It was just that like sitting and trying to be aware of all of my body movements, that are incorporated into meditation, just like really didn't work for me. And it's so easy to feel like you have to like a particular kind of mind-body activity, but it's not true. Just do whatever feels good for you. And because, at the end of the day, that's going to make you stick with it. And you want to be consistent with this. They've actually done research that shows that the more consistently you do these mind-body activities, the better it is. So rather than, say, spending an hour once a week meditating, if you spent like 2 minutes a day, but you did it every day, meditating, that's actually better for you and better for your HPA axis than doing it an hour once a week.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love your points there. So many of them. I love just introducing the idea that there's no right way to incorporate mind-body activities, and that everyone doesn't love meditation because it does involve sitting there and being mindful of your thoughts. And that isn't going to work for everybody. And I think it's important to note that you mentioned also finding something that you love to do. So, I mean, I don't have like something attached to my brain to measure my levels, but I would imagine that I would, if I were to say, take a walk, for example, or do something I really like. So I know I like yoga. Some of my friends love knitting. And there's so many different activities that you can do. A lot of my friends, a coloring book. A lot of my friends have like a pet. They can go walk their dog. I'm guessing that if you were to monitor your brain levels doing any of those things, you would have very similar stress reduction properties if you were kind of present in those activities and enjoying them.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And you bring up another point, which is the play aspect. When you're talking about your friends like petting their pets or playing with their pets, that aspect of fun and play and enjoyment is so important to our stress response as well, because it sort of immediately puts you into that rest and digest mode rather than fight or flight, because your body is like, oh, yay, I'm having fun. I get to play. I'm not like focused on work or, stressed out about some other thing in my life. I'm just simply enjoying being in the present moment. And so I think anything that you can do to really incorporate fun and play into your life is going to help your stress response so much. And that can be something as simple as, like you were saying, playing with your dog or your cat, or, if you wanted to plan like a little weekend away where you're doing something cool, like, I don't know, paddle boarding, that you just really like, but maybe you don't get to do that often. But just making sure that you have those opportunities to play is very, very helpful for your HPA axis to function normally.
Well, and I think there's this whole kind of idea in our culture that, like, you have fun when you're a kid and then you kind of grow up, quote unquote, and get mature. And part of that is apparently abandoning everything you ever loved to do. And
exactly.
Of course, I'm saying it real sarcastic, but we all know that there's an aspect of that in our culture. And so you've probably had this as well with your clients, Kelsey, where you kind of are asking them, what did you used to love to do? And you probably had a client look at you and say, I don't know.
Yeah.
And
totally.
And it's so, this is the problem with the world that we're living in right now, right? Because this whole idea that we have to grow up, quote unquote, and then give up everything we love. And I think especially for women, we're responsible for a lot of things. So, as a woman who's married, with children, I'm the household manager. Mm-hmm. It sounds good, right? That's what I'm calling it.
Yeah. Household manager, resume. Manager. Yeah.
But that's what it is though. And so a lot of the tasks, fall on women. So for example, if you have children, or if you're planning to have children, typically planning of the birthday parties falls on your shoulders. Remembering birthdays of family members and purchasing gifts. Or I'm saying that just because my son's birthday was literally like 2 days ago. But I'm just trying to point out, planning of meals, grocery shopping, organizing the home, doing the cleaning and cooking, or organizing it, or whatever. So you could actually list about 50 tasks that most women, not every woman has the same situation, but most women are primarily responsible for in her home.
Yeah.
And so, and then on top of that, then, she has her job, and then she has other, things, and she has friends. She's got other responsibilities, and you can completely see what I'm getting at. So she kind of, with all the responsibilities and requirements of her, then when does she ever really have time to look back and be like, when I was a kid, I really, really loved to color, and I really, really loved to draw, and it used to bring me so much joy. And I haven't touched my sketching pad for, 5 years.
Yep.
And so, yeah.
I was just going to say that if you can remember something like that you used to do, by all means, incorporate it. Like if you love to color, or you love to draw at one point in your life, bring that back. Spend a little bit of time every night or a couple times a week, whenever you can fit it in, just to draw and not feel like you have to accomplish anything out of it. You don't have to finish a drawing. You don't have to fill in the whole coloring book. It's just whatever you get done in the time that you have and you're enjoying that process. Like put on some music, listen to great music that you love while you do it. Just make it a really enjoyable experience. But if you're someone who, like you mentioned, Lisa, you ask people what they used to love and, what they enjoy. And a lot of times they do say, I honestly don't know. And if you're one of those people, if I asked you that question and you really think you couldn't answer that, what I would recommend is to just think of some activities that you might want to try. So that could be like taking a cooking class. It could be taking an art class. It could be learning how to surf. And, it could be literally anything that you can think of that you think you might enjoy. And make a list of those things. And then try to knock one of those off the list every week or every couple weeks. Whenever you can fit it in. I guarantee you will find something that you enjoy. And then you can make it a habit. You can incorporate that into your life on a regular basis so that you're getting that fun factor, that play factor into your life, and you're really enjoying it and feeling creative a lot of times, depending on the activity. And that, again, makes your HPA axis function so much better. It reduces your stress. And that's our whole goal here. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get our stress response to function normally so that we are only stressed when we actually need to be stressed rather than being stressed all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that you brought it back to that, because that was going to be one of my questions. So we're talking about these fun activities, and I think that it's kind of hard sometimes to really equate, say, going surfing or paddleboarding, which I tried this summer. It's actually awesome.
I want to try it. I've been meaning to try it, but I haven't yet.
Super great stress reduction right there. The connection between doing something like that and your health, it's still kind of, it seems kind of far away. So maybe you could kind of bring that back to the effects that doing these activities, doing them regularly, will have on your HPA axis. And also, we painted a pretty grim picture of how one would be feeling if they're experiencing adrenal fatigue. So how this could improve some of those symptoms.
Absolutely. So essentially, what those types of activities do is reduce your cortisol level. And remember that cortisol is our main stress hormone. And so when it's being overproduced because we're constantly stressed out, doing activities like this help to lower that. And it helps to sort of reset the HPA axis in a way so that it relearns that there are times in your life where you aren't stressed, where you don't need cortisol to be produced to, make you able to fight off a bear in your everyday life. So doing those activities really helps to reset the HPA axis, relearn what is normal, as a way to be feeling, which is that we should most of the time be in that rest and digest mode. And so when you knit or when you color or draw, those things are inherently relaxing. And so they help to make that negative feedback cycle work a little bit better, in that we then can turn off the HPA axis. It doesn't have to be stimulated, and you can just feel a little bit calmer, a little bit more relaxed, and your cortisol goes down. So those things over time, the more you do them, and again, that's why it's important to do them consistently, because if you just did it once a month or something, your body's not really learning anything necessarily. It's not learning that most of the time it should be in this rest and digest mode and what that feels like. It's just getting this once a month opportunity to relax. And, you can imagine that's probably not enough to truly heal a dysfunctional HPA axis.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things that, we've been talking about throughout this whole process is cortisol, because, that's our stress hormone. And so one of the things that you talked about when you kind of described what some of the symptoms are, it's cortisol being produced essentially when it's not supposed to be. So if you have like a huge surge of energy at 11 o'clock p.m., that's not when you're supposed to have high cortisol levels. So I guess maybe we can get into some of the lifestyle factors, dietary strategies, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about cortisol, because cortisol, again, isn't bad in and of itself. It has an important role. So when should we have cortisol? When shouldn't we? And how can we kind of encourage our body to get into the habit of producing it at the right times?
Yeah. So cortisol is a very important hormone. And I think we do often hear about it in a negative light because it is our stress hormone, and we equate stress with bad. We don't want stress, so we shouldn't want cortisol, right? But that's actually not true. What we want is to have the right amount of cortisol. And that's because cortisol plays a lot of different roles in the body, and it's a very important hormone because of that. For example, if your blood sugar gets too low, your body will pump out cortisol to start the process of gluconeogenesis, which is just making glucose from what you have in your body rather than getting it from your food, so that your blood sugar can get up to a normal level, even if you don't have food that you can eat at that moment. And so without that, if we didn't have cortisol for that process, or we didn't have enough cortisol for that process, our blood sugar would be low. And that's actually one of the symptoms of HPA axis dysregulation for people who their version of HPA axis dysregulation means that they're not producing enough cortisol, because there's kind of two levels here. Some people produce too much and some people don't produce enough. And so someone who doesn't produce enough can have some blood sugar issues related to that. cortisol is also very invested in the inflammation relationship to our body. So cortisol is inherently anti-inflammatory. So when you are, you have an infection or you got a cut or something, a wound that needs to be healed, your body's going to produce cortisol to help fight that inflammation that happens. And that's why actually you're prescribed steroids a lot of times if your body needs to heal or you need to reduce inflammation in the body because it's a potent anti-inflammatory. Based on those things, you can kind of understand that cortisol isn't bad necessarily. And in a lot of ways, it's actually a great thing to have. And it's a normal thing to have because like we were talking about before with the fight or flight response, that's a normal process that happens for a reason. And those are the times where we need that extra cortisol around to help us survive. But when we're producing too much of it or not enough of it, then we get into trouble. And that's where we get those symptoms of adrenal fatigue. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of things can feed into that. We were talking about poor diet before. And so one of the things that you can do to help your HPA axis function a bit more normally is to eat a good diet. And of course, when I say a good diet, I mean one that is nutrient rich. So, you were mentioning that Laura was on your podcast earlier, and I would definitely recommend listening to that episode to learn a little bit more about what a nutrient rich diet is, but also simply eating enough or eating enough of the particular macronutrients like protein, fat, and carbohydrates to fuel the type of activity that you're doing in your everyday life. And when you're not eating enough or you're eating, for example, way too little carbohydrate compared to the amount of intense physical activity that you're doing, your body goes into this stress mode and it creates more cortisol to try to keep up with the demand for glucose that your body needs, or just to kind of get through a time where it's not getting enough calories in general. And of course, that's going to have a negative impact on our HPA axis because it's a chronic stressor over time. Mm-hmm. I was just going to jump into overexercise, but if you have a question about diet, I can answer it too.
Actually, I'll let you talk about overexercise because that's something that I wanted to ask you about anyways, the effect of exercise and how do you know how much is too much?
Sure. So this is always a big question. And it's because really that we know that exercise is a healthy activity, but on the other hand of that, it can actually be hurting someone. And this, we use this term over-exercise a lot, but I actually like to think about it a little bit more as under-recovery. So somebody can exercise a lot. Let's think about, Olympians, for example. They're exercising a lot, but that's like their full-time job. They're recovering a ton because they're doing so much intense activity. They're eating thousands and thousands of calories a day. They're sleeping well. They're doing everything in their life to reduce stress outside of that crazy physical activity that they're doing. And if you are someone who is doing a lot of physical activity in your life, you need to properly recover from that. So you need to sleep enough. You need to eat enough to fuel that activity. And you need to keep other stressors in your life as low as possible so that your body doesn't have other stressors to worry about. And so it's more about matching the amount of activity that you're doing based on the amount that you can put, the amount of energy that you can put into recovering. So let's say, your job is really, really stressful and you are also working out at CrossFit 7 days a week. Usually that's a recipe for disaster for many of the women that I work with. And that's because of the stress of their job and how much they are mentally stressed out all the time, their body just simply can't recover from the intense physical activity that they're doing every day of the week. They're not giving their body a chance to rest because they have no rest day if they're doing it 7 days a week. A lot of times they're not sleeping enough because they're waking up early for work. So maybe they're getting like 6 or 7 hours of sleep despite working out for an hour or 2 hours every day, doing weightlifting and high intensity interval training, things like that. And so they're simply just not matched up. They're not balancing the amount of recovery that they're doing for the amount of activity that they're doing. So does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. And this is something that I've seen with some of the clients that I work with. So I, do fertility awareness education. And so then we use the menstrual cycle as a tool. So the menstrual cycle, it will give you feedback. So for example, if you're exercising too much and kind of draining your body, you'll see certain signs in your menstrual cycle. You'll see the signs of your body struggling to kind of produce enough hormones to make everything work right. But we live in the world, so it's not like we kind of live independent of our societal expectations. So how do you address this topic of exercise then with your female clients who feel those pressures to sculpt their bodies in a certain way and, look a certain way? I think we're all really hard on ourselves. We've all had friends who will tell you like, oh my gosh, I have to lose 10 pounds. And you look at them and you're like, but you're gorgeous and perfect the way you are. But they don't see that when they look in the mirror. They see this 10 pounds and they will not be satisfied until it's gone. So how do you kind of address that issue?
It can be a very difficult thing to address. So I'll start by saying that. But the main way that I work on that is by working on mindset. And I do that just simply by talking to my clients about, what is your body capable of? Like, what amazing things can your body do? Like, have you already had a child? That's an amazing thing. Like, can you even believe that was able to happen? Like, good for you. That's awesome. Can you lift, however much weight? Can you swim however long? Like, your body is capable of such amazing things that have nothing to do with its appearance. And so simply by asking someone to recount the amazing things that their body is capable of or has been capable of can be very useful. I also like to have people think about things that they like about their body, because a lot of times, we focus on the one or two things that we absolutely hate, but we don't think about the things that we really actually enjoy about the way that we look. And we're so focused on the other things that we don't like. So simply thinking about the things that you do like, or listening to compliments that people give you. Maybe your husband says, wow, you look really amazing in that dress. And you're like, oh, no, I don't. It makes my butt look big, or, whatever. We downplay all of the compliments that we do get. And that sends a signal to our brain to focus on the negative rather than the positive. And so, really listen to the compliments that people give you, because they mean those things. They're not seeing the things that you think about negatively about your body. They're seeing these amazing qualities that more often than not, you're overlooking. Well, yeah. The other thing go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say, we're told that exercise is healthy. And so I think it's really hard to get kind of our heads around the fact that the way our lives are so stressful and there's so many things going on for us that we're not saying exercise isn't healthy, but how you're doing it isn't healthful for you right now.
Yes. And this is something that, especially when I have clients who do have adrenal fatigue, often one of the first recommendations that I make is to cut down on their exercise, because at that point, their body's cortisol production is so off that it really... It can't handle exercise at that moment, or it can't handle the intensity of the exercise that this person is doing, or the quantity of exercise that this person is doing. And so that can be a really tough thing for some people to hear, that they need to cut down on their exercise, because a lot of times, A, they're thinking of exercise as one of their main forms of stress relief, and B, it's often such a habit and they do it so much that, it's hard to think about, okay, what am I going to do during this time? Or am I going to gain like 50 pounds because I stopped exercising and my body is like just going to freak out and not know what's going on? But the reason that I recommend this is because, again, when you're doing exercise in an imbalance compared to the amount that you can recover, it is a stressor. And when you're trying to recover from adrenal fatigue, we are trying to knock out any stressors that we can. And I know that can be hard for people to have to take out or reduce the amount of exercise that they're doing, but I like to fill that time with other really wonderful things like play, like we were talking about, or getting extra sleep. So instead of waking up at 5:30 a.m. every morning so that you can go to the gym for an hour before work, sleep in, enjoy that. Spend some extra time like cuddling with your husband in bed, or, go to the movies with your husband or your friends, spend time with your family. So fill those times that you would have been using for exercise to cultivate some of these other really great habits that help to reduce cortisol and reset the HPA axis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I really like the way that you talk about it. It's kind of a really realistic kind of just way to address that, acknowledging the fears that your clients may have around that, which is like, if I stop working out every day, I'm going to get really fat and just everything's going to fall apart.
Right.
And so really kind of addressing that, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It could just involve taking out like one day or two a week for the overall benefit. I find that that's a challenging conversation to have. And I think that, sometimes I just think that the stress is on women to kind of, it's like there's so many things that we're supposed to have together. So not only are we supposed to have this perfect fertility, perfect 28-day menstrual cycles, that are supposed to just flip back. So even if we've been on hormonal contraceptives for like 12 years, they're just supposed to snap back just like that.
Magic, right?
Right, totally. And we're supposed to be like toothpick skinny all the time. All of us are supposed to apparently look the same. And we're all, like, our bodies are supposed to all kind of look in this way.
Right.
And then we're supposed to hold it, down at work, and we're supposed to hold it down at home, and we're supposed to have all of these things all together. And if you take a moment and step out of that, and our bodies are supposed to be perfectly sculpted, like fitness models. It doesn't make sense. You cannot have all of that at the same time.
No.
Like, it's like either one or the other. You can choose to either look like Olympian, or, you know what I mean? Like, you just can't have it all. So I could go on about that.
We think that we need to have it all, when in reality, if we did have it all, we would feel terrible. So we might look like we have it all together, but we would be miserable. So I think it's, more than saying you can have one or the other, I think you can say you could have it all, but you'd be horribly unhappy. Or you can be happy and have the parts that are important, the parts that you value. And that's going to vary from person to person and woman to woman, what are the most important things in your life. And I think people should spend some time thinking about, what are my values? Do I value spending time with my family? Do I value being great at my job? Do I value eating meals and cooking meals with my family and eating healthy food to maintain my health? Or do I value, the way I look on its own, regardless of these other things? And spending time really writing down or journaling about the values that you have can help you make decisions about the habits and the activities that you're doing that are more in line with those values. Because a lot of times we do things that are out of alignment with the values that we actually have, but we don't realize it until we actually kind of think about it and say, wow, this doesn't make sense for me. Why am I spending hours and hours on the treadmill every day to look this way when it's making me feel horrible, when in reality, I would much rather feel better and be able to live my life joyfully and be able to spend quality time with my family and friends feeling good, rather than looking good but feeling terrible.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that gets at such an important point of focusing. It's kind of like when, you take it back with food, you take it back to basics and you focus on nutrient dense foods instead of just whatever you can get your hands on, focusing on how you actually feel. And the interesting thing is that, in the podcast that I do, it's all around fertility and improving your health. And of course, optimizing your chances of conception. If you feel horrible all the time, this is an indication that your body is out of balance. And so aiming to feel good instead of aiming for a certain target weight or a certain target kind of look is a much more beneficial option all around.
Absolutely. And that's a hard lesson to learn for a lot of people, and especially for women a lot of times. But the more that you can think about that and think about how important that is to you to feel good or to have, a healthy cycle, because like you said, when you feel healthy and when you are healthy, your cycle should also be healthy. And that can come at the expense of maybe a six-pack, but for a lot of women, that trade-off is well worth it. But you just have to recognize that for you, that is worth it.
Mm-hmm. Well, given our conversation today, like, trust me, Kelsey, I could just keep asking you questions and we could keep having this chat until like 4 o'clock, but I'm sure neither you or I can actually do that today. But, we've talked about so many things and I'm really excited to share this conversation with my audience. But given our discussion, what is the one thing that you'd want our listeners to take from this conversation that we've had today?
Oh, such a good question. It's so hard to distill it down to one thing. But I think, honestly, the note that we just sort of ended on there is one of the most important things that people can remember, because when you realize what is important to you, the things that we have in our life that can stress us out don't need to be there anymore. If you are valuing how you feel and the health of your body, you don't need to be going to CrossFit 7 days a week and stressing your body out. Or maybe you realize that, the job you're in is not right for you because it's stressing you out far too much and it's not worth it. Or maybe you realize that, the diet that you're eating is just not in alignment with being healthy and feeling good. And so you need to make changes there to reduce that stress on your body from a poor diet. And so just remembering that health is really, for a lot of us, and I think for a lot of your listeners, the most important thing, especially as you go through the rest of your life. If you are healthy, you're going to be so much happier. You're not going to have to deal with a lot of the chronic conditions that other people deal with because they are stressed out all the time, or they're eating a poor diet, they're over-exercising or under-exercising, So I think that determining what you as a person value and then aligning your behavior with those values will go a long way in making you a healthier and happier person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I have a couple of questions that I typically ask at the end of the show. And so the first one, what would you say is the biggest myth about fertility that you'd like to see corrected?
Well, the biggest one is probably the nutrition factor, where, a lot of times with the education around fertility and diet, there is so much misinformation, that you should still be eating low fat or low cholesterol, that we don't get advised about eating nutrient-rich foods like liver, other organ meats that are really amazing in terms of their nutrient density and especially for fertility. So it would certainly be that, you need to eat a nutrient-rich diet, and that might not be what you think it is.
Yeah, because you can eat healthy, but that might mean something completely different to you or me than it does to your average person.
Exactly.
And I won't even get into that. And so final question of the day, for a woman who's currently on the pill and she knows she doesn't want to get pregnant right away, but she does know that within a couple of years she does want to get pregnant, what advice, if any, would you give to her?
Great question. Well, I think there's a lot that you can do to prepare your body for pregnancy in a really slow but intentional way. So, I'm not sure when this person would want to come off of the pill. That's sort of a decision that they need to make, but know that there is some time, like we were talking about, you can't be on the pill for 12 years and then expect that the next month after you're off of it, you're going to be ready to conceive. The body, unfortunately, does not work that way. So you do need to realize that it may take more time to get back to a healthy cycle than you might think. Then I would also just, even while you're still on the pill, make sure you're eating a nutrient-dense diet. So go listen to that episode with my co-host, Laura Schoenfeld, where she talks about nutrient density and how important it is for conceiving and preparing for pregnancy. Lowering your stress, of course. Anything that you can do right now to ensure that your body is in a low-stress mode when you start to try to conceive is going to do so much. Your hormones will recover faster after you get off the pill when you're in a low stress mode. Of course, your body is going to be in a better position to conceive because it knows that it can do that right now. It's not like, oh God, I'm so stressed. This is not a good time to bring a baby into the world, because it could think that there's no food around. It could think you're in a famine, or it could think that there's predators everywhere. And it's like, I don't want to bring a baby into this. This is dangerous. So you need to make your body know that it's not in a high stress situation and it's safe to bring a baby into that world. And so reducing the stress in your life doing a lot of the things that we talked about today, like incorporating play or human connection and touch, sleeping enough, eating enough, incorporating some of those mind-body activities, anything that you can do to reduce the amount of stress that your body feels is going to let your body know that it's safe to bring a baby into the world.
I think it couldn't be better words to end on. Kelsey, thank you so much for being here today. It was so great talking to you. I really appreciated your knowledge, your insight, your experience, your humor, and I know that the audience is going to love this interview as well.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It was really a pleasure.
Well, and for our listeners then who wanting to learn more about you and the work that you do, where can they go to find more information?
You can go to healthyguthealthylife.com, which is my personal website. You can go to theancestralrds.com, which is the podcast that I run with my co-host Laura Schoenfeld. And you can also go to mypaleorehab.com, which is Laura and I created a program specifically about healing from adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysregulation. And so it's a step-by-step program that you can go through to recover. And so it would be very, very useful for someone who feels like they might have adrenal fatigue and they're trying to conceive. We're running a group of that in October. And if you want to just learn more about HPA axis in general, we have a free ebook on that website that you can grab, and then you'll be signed up for our emails, and we'll let you know when the group is starting in October.
Okay, great. And I will include all of those links on the show notes page. So if you're on the go, you don't have to worry about writing those down now. But thank you again, Kelsey. It was really great having you on the show.
Thanks so much, Lisa.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/99. I really enjoyed my conversation with Kelsey today. We got into so many different things about stress, and a few of the things that I really love that we actually covered today was the idea that, or rather challenging the idea that there's only one right way to manage stress. So, even I've talked a lot about meditation and visualization on different podcast episodes, and there's a lot of information out there that would suggest that that is the only way to manage stress. So what I loved is that in this episode, we touched on different ways to manage stress and really incorporating play into your life and connecting with things that you enjoy, things that you have loved to do. And maybe you haven't given yourself permission to do some of those things that you used to really love to do. And so that's one of the things that I really love that it came out in our episode today. What I also liked about this interview is that Kelsey brought up the topic of exercise. And I think that it's a really important conversation to have because, some of us exercise a ton, some of us don't really exercise very much. And often it's kind of like it's one or the other. Either you exercise and go to the gym every day or you don't exercise at all. And I think as well, there's kind of that idea that when you exercise and start working out, that you need to do it, 4 or 5 days a week. What would be the point if you only did it once or twice? And so, what I really liked about our conversation is that it just really brought it back to the impact that it's having on your body. I really like the way that Kelsey talked about it not necessarily being the exercise itself, but are you giving your body enough time to recover? I really like the way that she kind of broke that down because then it helps you to understand whether or not it could actually be a stressor in your body. So, I think that it's encouraging this idea of balance and creating a balanced perspective and creating a balanced life for yourself. And although exercise can actually be one of the important factors to help you reduce your stress, too much exercise can actually increase your stress. And so really being conscious of that and aware of that and trying to find a balance. So if you've been enjoying the podcast, please do look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. Make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com and join my email list. And also, if this is the first time that you're listening to the podcast, make sure to go ahead and hit subscribe so that you never miss an episode. If you have an idea for a podcast episode or a guest suggestion, send me an email at info@fertilityfriday.com. And I just want to thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really appreciate all of you listening, tuning in, sharing it with your friends, shouting out on social media, however you're connecting with me. I really appreciate it there's no show without you guys listening. Otherwise, it's just me alone podcasting in my basement. So I really appreciate all of the support, and I really appreciate just all of the feedback and the comments and emails. So thanks again. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.